Welcome everyone. Come on in. Hi everybody. Good evening. We are going to give a couple of minutes to let our other hosts join and to give some time for people to. All right, welcome. Hooray, we did it! Yes, thank you so much to everybody who's joining. I'm going to say this a couple of times, but I do want to thank everybody for their patience since last time Instagram was having some problems, but we made it. We're here.
Very excited.
Same. And so we're going to give just a couple of minutes, and we're going to wait for Lindsey, who's our other host, to hop on. And then once we see we got some people in the space, then we'll get started.
Awesome.
I think there she is. Okay. So we'll give that a second. Hi, everyone who's joining.
Hello.
Hello. We're here.
We did it.
Same reaction. We did it.
I feel like the excitement between all of us is palpable, both for the event and also for it working this time around in terms of hosts joining. So hello, everybody. I think we can probably get started. We got some people in the space with us. So welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for tuning in to this extremely important event, Where Did My Period Go, with Lindsey and with Rachel, and we'll have time to introduce ourselves and everything. My name, to start there, is Temimah Zucker, and I am a licensed clinical social worker, also known as a therapist, and I really work with people struggling with eating disorders, disordered eating, body image, and general mental health struggles. And I'm here representing the Mindful Eating Project, which is an amazing, amazing resource in our community to help those with eating disorders and disordered eating. There's a free hotline where people can call in totally anonymously to get information, ask questions, get more support. And it's really just a space, that we need to learn more. So you can learn more about the Mindful Eating Project by visiting our Instagram page. There's our website. There's a number for the hotline. And before we begin and kind of dive in a little bit and do even introductions, I do want to note for everyone, this is an educational event. This is not in place of a visit to a dietitian or a doctor or a therapist. It's really a space for us to share information and for you to learn more, and then for you to use the information to maybe gather more information, even ask questions, see how it could apply to you or someone maybe that you love or want to support. So I just want to make that super clear. So I'm going to start, Rachel, by asking you if you can introduce yourself and tell us more about SBH and the role in the program tonight.
Awesome. So my name is Rachel Hazan. Here in front of Andrea tonight to represent SBH Fertility. I'm one of the chairs of the division. We started about 4 years ago to help community couples dealing with infertility, which I know is going to probably come up a lot tonight, as well as pregnancy loss at any stage of pregnancy, up to and including, God forbid if needed, going into the hospital for a stillbirth, and sort of anything in between, as well as prenatal and postnatal issues, sort of anything that runs across the reproductive and maternal health field. We do individualized case management, referral to medical specialists, therapists, nutritionists, anything that would be needed across the fertility journey. We have a peer-to-peer program. We have lots of Instagram lives for educational events. We do support groups, which are incredible, and I'm going to get to that soon. And we can also refer to nurses and yoga instructors from the community, and really basically be there for you for whatever may come up. Coming up actually this summer, we have some very exciting programs and events. We have our birth trauma workshop, which we've run successfully twice previously and are running again this summer. So look out for that, as well as all of our support groups are starting up again. We do a lot of pre-registrations, so just try and get those registrations in, because we do actually fill up before we even advertise. And we're also having our Together We Grow event this summer again at the home of Lee and Lisa Cohen. It's going to be on August 16th, and it's going to be awesome. I personally could just say that I'm so excited about tonight. We have seen, unfortunately, so often how eating disorders plays a role in fertility, again, throughout the fertility journey, not necessarily even those who are just trying to conceive, and I'm sure we're going to get to a lot of that tonight. But something I'm always talking to our clients about is being in a healthy mind and healthy body in order to conceive children, to carry your children, and also to help care for your children. I think it's all three, and they deserve their time and attention, each of them. But certainly this is something that we've seen impacting our clients, of which there last count 185 active clients across all of the fertility spaces that we cover. So certainly seeing this often, and really excited to learn along with you, because this is not a space that I'm a professional in. So I'm really excited, and I can't wait to hear from Lindsey. I apologize if I overspoke. This is really Lindsey's night.
Thank you, Rachel. Okay, great. And so for people to know, feel free as we're going to ask questions. We're going to have space for questions, likely sort of when we take a pause, or maybe at the end of Lindsey, when there's like a chunk of what you share, but people can totally ask questions. So Lindsey, can you introduce yourself to all of us?
Yeah, so I'm so excited. Thank you guys for reaching out about doing this event. I think that it's so important. I think that it's an under talked about issue, and incredibly important, as you already kind of mentioned, Rachel, like across the lifespan, right? So it's not just about fertility, right? It's just about like quality of life, and of course being able to grow and expand your family if that's a goal of yours. And so I'm Lindsey Lusson. I'm a registered dietitian. I've been a dietitian for 12 years now. Kind of worked all across the board, but what I do now is I specialize in disordered eating and infertility. So I work with a lot of women who are experiencing infertility issues related to a past or a current eating disorder. As we know, with eating disorders, they can kind of follow you, sometimes even more the mental side than the physical side and the behaviors, into different parts of your life. And so what I'm working with in my practice is women who have maybe completely lost their menstrual cycle. So maybe they haven't had a period in 5 years, 10 years, 15 years, and now they're experiencing infertility issues as a result. I also work with women who do have cycles, but maybe they're irregular, or maybe they're struggling with not being able to ovulate on their own, or maybe they're struggling with recurrent miscarriage, and we start talking more about their history with food and movement and body image, and some of these things start to come up. And so in my practice, I'm really just helping women learn to re-nourish their bodies appropriately for fertility and improve their relationship with food and their body so that they can go on to be healthy mamas.
Amazing. Okay, so hypothalamic amenorrhea is quite a mouthful, and could be a totally unfamiliar, diagnosis, if you will. So, Lindsey, if you are down to take us away in terms of sharing more about what that is and kind of what we need to know.
Yeah, absolutely. So it is kind of a newer diagnosis, kind of showing up in the literature somewhere like late 80s, and really only being kind of talked about, I feel like, in more like lay terms over the past to 10 years. When I have a personal history with this. So when I was trying to figure out, post healing from an eating disorder, what was going on with my body, the term was like nowhere to be found. But now it is coming up more, which makes me super excited. So let's break it down, because it's a pretty big kind of like tongue twister, right? So hypothalamic is referring to the area in the brain that's responsible for a variety of body functions. So our temperature regulation, our mood regulation, but most kind of importantly for what we'll talk about tonight is the control and release of hormones. And then the other part of the word amenorrhea means that you are not getting a cycle at all, or kind of more clinically defined as no period for 3 months or longer. Some doctors will say, come see me in 6 months, but really, if someone hasn't had a cycle in over 3 months, no period at all, that is really the time where, we should be, raising eyebrows, going to see clinicians, and having some further testing done.
Okay.
And HA happens, there's kind of three things that are at play when somebody does have hypothalamic amenorrhea, and that is stress, underfueling, and overexercising. And while one of those things alone could trigger irregularities in cycles, difficulty ovulating, when we have full-blown HA, it's typically some sort of combination of all three, even if it's like 5% here, 95% there.
Okay.
Well, everyone's pretty stressed, so I guess
What I do tell people though, when they're kind of trying to decide like, hey, is this me? And we can kind of go through like some, red flags and things that are coming up is, in my practice, what I've observed about stress is stress can absolutely impact ovulation. It can impact your cycle, like your cycle length, but stress alone, physical stress, unless it's like prolonged trauma, and even still once the trauma is resolved and appropriately worked through with therapy, it's typically not going to keep somebody's period missing for years on end. So when we think about HA, there is almost always an underfueling component going on.
So if someone is like hearing this now and thinking, is this me? What are some markers that they might be looking for in terms of, so we said the, the loss of the period for 3 months, are there other things they'd be paying attention to?
Yeah. So also just to give you guys some statistics. So HA is, according to the American Society of Reproductive Medicine, it's responsible for up to 20 to 35% cases of secondary amenorrhea, meaning that somebody started their period at a normal age and then now it's like magically missing, right? So like kind of a big chunk there, but however, it's also a diagnosis of exclusion. So when we go to our OB-GYN and we're, trying to decide if this is us from a medical perspective, they're going to, first say, okay, like, how long has your period been missing? And then they're going to be trying to rule out PCOS, premature ovarian insufficiency, POI. They're also going to be trying to rule out thyroid dysfunction and pituitary tumor. And so if none of those things fit and a person has had no period for 3 months or longer, we're going to then look at some of our hormone levels. And if we see estrogen is less than 50, FSH or follicular stimulating hormone is less than 10, and LH luteinizing hormone is less than 10. After excluding those four conditions, then we're kind of landing on that diagnosis of HA. So it is kind of like a process to get that formal diagnosis, and sometimes people kind of in their own research with some labs and a couple of doctor's visits do end up kind of landing on the diagnosis themselves. Unfortunately, some people don't get the HA diagnosis because they'll kind of get lost in the weeds. There can be some overlap with PCOS, and so it can get really confusing when we're just looking at labs or we're just looking at somebody from a clinical perspective. As we know, like with eating disorders, body size isn't really going to determine who has an eating disorder or not, and so someone can have some very disordered thoughts and behaviors around food leading to the loss of their period, but appear very normal, and the diagnosis can unfortunately be missed.
Sorry, could you speak a little bit to the connection between PCOS and HA, because I've heard a lot of overlap, but sort of confusing to everyone.
So it definitely can get confusing again when we're just looking at labs. So in order for someone to receive a PCOS diagnosis, they have to have 2 out of 3 of the following: a missing or irregular period, elevated androgens, and cysts on their ovaries. Now, if someone isn't getting a regular cycle, they might be growing some follicles or cysts. And from an ultrasound perspective, if somebody is seeing cysts and somebody maybe in their mind kind of already has it made up, like, oh, this person probably has PCOS. I've seen a lot of people with HA unfortunately get misdiagnosed with PCOS before they realize that they have HA going on. So while the two conditions are very different in the way that they should present and the way that they're treated, there can be a little bit of confusion, and I have seen some misdiagnosis pretty commonly.
So if someone is listening right now and they're sort of like, ooh, I'm not sure, all those different things to look for, and they haven't had their period for 3-4 months, and they go to the doctor, is there a recommendation of like, this is what I should be asking in terms of, what to look for? I know you mentioned the hormones, or even like what tests to perform to rule stuff out and then to figure out getting to this, especially if you said doctors might not even be so aware. Is there like any language they can bring with them?
Yeah. I think some of it's going to come down to the individual and kind of asking yourself some hard questions. And so kind of thinking about like, what does my movement look like? Like, am I exercising every single day? Do I have a hard time taking a day off from exercise? When I do take a day off from exercise, then do I feel like I can't eat as much? Do I feel like I withhold food when I don't get to burn it off? Am I doing exercise because I ate, air quotes, bad foods over the weekend and now I'm trying to burn them off? Am I trying to maintain a body weight or body size that might be too small for me? And then also kind of thinking about your relationship with food. Do I have a lot of rules and restrictions around food? Do I count calories? Do I count macros? Am I intermittent fasting? Am I following a really low carbohydrate diet? Do I get stressed out when other people are, you know, cooking for me? So there's a lot of like kind of questions that I think the person needs to ask themselves, and kind of a deep dive on their relationship with food, exercise, and their body, in addition to, of course, working with your physician and having those labs done.
Okay. Can you repeat the labs that someone would ask for? Because I could just imagine someone being like, wanting to write down, like, what am I asking for with this?
Absolutely. So I would say at a baseline, get your estrogen, your progesterone, your FSH, and your LH done. If you're kind of deciding between the PCOS versus HA route, definitely have free testosterone done. I think that's one thing that will point you a lot more towards PCOS, is if we're seeing elevated androgens. But at a baseline, estrogen, progesterone, FSH, and LH would be the ones that I would definitely have tested.
I actually also love what Lindsey said about, like, you got to sort of know yourself and be able to maybe speak to the doctor about, I'm not sure if this is something that I may be going through or dealing with, but because a lot of those testing are sort of typical if you're going to a doctor or fertility specialist, but I think becoming a little more empowered to say, let me do a little internal review here. I may have a different issue going on that I want you to, doctor, please keep in mind as we do this initial testing.
That can be hard, right? Because I think if somebody is, you know, whether they're deeply engrossed in disordered eating or that maybe they consider themselves recovered, it's like sometimes we don't want to like open that door back up. So it can be a tough conversation to have, you know, with yourself or even with the people who know you best. But sometimes that can be helpful too, is like bringing other people in and being like, hey, this is what I'm learning. This is what I'm reading. Does this sound like me? And kind of asking for maybe a little bit more like objective view from people who know you best.
I think it also, talking about like how it requires honesty with oneself and like the strength and courage to ask, I think it also requires, even, you sort of touched on this, the recognition of, can I admit that this might be a struggle in terms of my relationship to food and exercise, you know? And we know that it's so prevalent and common that people are compensating for food with exercise, and it's almost like, yeah, of course everyone does that, when really that's not something that would be considered a healthy relationship with food. And so to pause and even say like, oh, this is the thing that I've done for such a long time. Wait, maybe this is not actually what's like healthiest for me, even if it feels compulsive or like what everyone I know does, or even just I've been doing it for so long. It's taking that moment to like whisper almost quietly to yourself, like, this could be a problem, which can be a really hard first step.
Especially as it relates to exercise, because we're like, it's exercise. I'm doing this for my health, you know. So I think you sort of have to rejigger the priorities almost. Just feel like, let's reframe here.
Lindsey, on that note, it's a great transition. Can you tell us more about assessing with exercise? Like, when is it sort of a problem for the person, or just objectively, what does that look like in terms of determining that issue?
Yeah. Well, when we start talking about like how much exercise is too much, like it's always going to be variable per person, right? Like some people can train for marathons and 100-mile races and never experience issues with their period or their fertility. And then there can be people who are just recreational exercisers and they like, you know, just really love going to that spin class or something, and then they're running into it. So, you know, when we look at like statistics of athletic women or women who exercise regularly, it's estimated that about half are going to experience some level of, they call call it menstrual disturbances. So that might mean that maybe you do get your period, but you're not ovulating regularly. That might also mean that you ovulate, but your body's not able to produce enough progesterone in the luteal phase to support your body either getting pregnant or staying pregnant. And so we have kind of this subset of the population that are going to be a little bit more sensitive to exercise. And so if some of these things, or luteal phase or anovulation or amenorrhea are showing up for you, then we can kind of assume, hey, genetically your body is a little bit more sensitive. But the other like big factor that's going to be at play is fueling. And so if you are exercising a ton and you're not replacing those calories, you're not at least breaking even with what you're doing, then your body is under a state of stress. And I love that you kind of like already alluded to the fact, Rachel, that like it can be normalized, right? Like, oh, you had a big meal, like, make sure you balance that with exercise, right? And women that develop with HA, I think we're taking things a little more extreme, right? So we are always burning off what we exercise, and we're always kind of marrying the two. It's hard for us to kind of see them not existing together or not having some sort of relationship. And so what we typically see in women that are experiencing HA is a lot of exercise and a lot of high intensity exercise. So think about running, think about CrossFit, think about heavy weightlifting. Some of these really popular boutique studio classes like F45 and Orange Theory Fitness, like super fun, but like when somebody's in those classes 6 days a week, never taking a day off and under fueling, that's kind of where the perfect storm with period loss kind of starts to develop.
Can you speak to the idea? So there's so much to go with here. In terms of I want to note, I feel like movement, we can all agree, is healthy for a person, right? Like we need to keep our heart strong. I mean, you know way more about this than I do, but there's nothing wrong with movement. And yet it's become, I think, synonymous nowadays with burning off calories or energy. Like, so if someone says, I had this great workout this morning, people automatically think around something around that, or around weight or something, as opposed to, I just am doing joyful movement, or I'm moving for the sake of, keeping my heart strong, like I said, as like a sort of easy example, and how it's become almost like conflated with a way of trying to lose weight, and nothing else. So you mentioned like not eating enough and exercising 6 days a week, and everyone's so different, but is there a line of like, when is movement like too much, even if the person is eating enough? Like, is there sort of something that you can tell us more about with that guidance?
Yeah, definitely. And I think it also is going to kind of go back to like the self-assessment, right? So we talk about signs of exercise addiction is like, how do you feel when you take that rest day? Or how do you feel whenever, the plan falls through, you had to work late, so you missed your workout, or the baby didn't sleep through the night, and so now it's hard for you to wake up for the workout. So like, are you feeling anxious? Are you feeling stressed because you didn't get that workout in? I think that that's kind of a red flag that like, hey, maybe we need to re-examine the whole reason why we're working out in the first place. I'll also say, like, what I see in my practice with women with HA, we are typically kind of somewhere on the spectrum of like exercise addiction. And so with that, we'll see people feel like, they'll go from turning a 30-minute workout into a 45-minute workout into a 60, into a 90, right? It's like they can't get enough, and they're always kind of upping their game on intensity and duration. Workouts that kind of spill over and start impacting our social life, right? So like maybe now we miss the work happy hour because we want to make that exercise class, or we just can't stand to sleep in and spend time with our family because we're so addicted to our 5 a.m. run. And of course, that's always going to be a fine line, right? Because there are going to be people who are really dedicated and really committed to their exercise routine, and maybe being active is part of their job. But what I'll always say about my athlete clients is all athletes take rest days and they have an off season. And so it's about balancing that and being with resting your body in addition to moving your body.
Amazing. That's so helpful. Can you talk about elevated cortisol and what the heck that means?
So cortisol is one of our stress hormones, and this is one of the reasons why we want to really pay attention to how much movement we're doing, especially if we're starting to experience some infertility issues and we're not really sure why, and we identify as a really active person. And so our body secretes cortisol in as a result of stressful situations. This isn't always like a horrible thing. This is like a protective mechanism to keep our bodies safe. However, whenever we are overstressing our bodies, our cortisol levels can always be high. Sky high cortisol levels are like not really the state that our body wants to live in. And one of the things that could be contributing to that is exercise and over-exercise. And so when we talk about period recovery and being able to return to a state of nourishment and being able to ovulate and body feeling safe enough to make a baby, it typically does require a reduction in the intensity of exercise. And this can be really hard for people to take in, but it might mean, you know, for a season we're sidelining the high intensity interval training and we're trading that for like a gentle restorative.
Typically more the high cardio workouts that are creating this cortisol spike, not necessarily just exercise generally. It's specifically that.
The higher intensity things.
So if someone is sort of looking to change their relationship with exercise, and especially if it's, you know, sort of sparked, and we'll talk more about this in terms of the fertility and infertility piece, but if it's sparked by this HA diagnosis, it sounds like you're saying replacing some type of movement with others, or are there other ways of approaching exercise in that kind of recovery phase of that process that would be different than what they were doing before?
Yeah, sure. I would say, like, on a baseline level, if someone is able to recognize, like, oh, hey, like, took it a little too far with the exercise, like, you know, hey, like, gentle restorative yoga sounds great. I'm gonna pursue that. I would also encourage that person listening to make sure you're also learning to be okay with, like, taking a full rest day. Like, hey, it's okay to sleep in on a Saturday and, like, go to brunch with your friends, or, you know, it's okay to, like, take a day off and not move your body. Like, learning to be okay with that might be one of the harder parts of recovery for some of these people, but it's a really important piece, because more of like the exposure therapy, if someone is dealing with a true exercise addiction, is going to be really important. And so there are some clients that I work with that have very addictive personalities, especially when it comes to exercise. And so it's like, okay, well, like, you know, the 20-minute yoga is never going to be enough for me. And in those situations, sometimes it can be really beneficial to do like a full exercise break. And that might feel a little bit extreme, but that's what I have found works best with people who are feeling incredibly addicted to exercise. When we talk about, you know, how we might approach treating other types of addictions, it's not like, oh, we'll just give you a little bit of this and a little bit of that. It's like we really do have to have kind of, again, the exposure therapy of like, all right, I didn't work out today and the world didn't stop turning, and I can move on and I can find new healthy ways to cope. So I would say that, you know, setting some limits is important, incorporating in rest days, and also learning ways to healthfully cope with the stress that's on your plate, right? Because a lot of times exercise is seen as a way for managing stress, and it can be a really wonderful tool, but if somebody's doing this to the point where they're compromising their fertility or they've lost their period, we've got to get some more tools.
Totally. And something I think about a lot with folks when I'm seeing them with an eating disorder, and that can include exercise addiction, is even thinking about, like, do you like the exercise you're doing? Because there are so many people who will say, like, I've never thought about that question before, you know, or they're like, no, you know, like, I really dislike running, but I do it and it's high, you know, high intensity or something. And then I use the expression before, joyful movement, like even thinking about a type of movement that actually feels fun, which can be sometimes out of the box of like, I'm going to rock climb, I'm going to dance, I'm going to, you know, do something different. But it also then kind of changes the relationship with movement, because it's less about this rigorous, rigid, you know, platform, and it's more of like, I like it. It's fine. When sometimes people love running, you know, but sometimes it's kind of like, this is so not what I enjoy doing with my time, kind of a thing.
Yeah. And another exercise I'll encourage some of my clients towards, like on that note, would be how about doing an exercise like without your fitness tracker, so that like we don't know how many miles you ran or how many calories you burn. I wonder if we could just tap into like how that makes your body feel versus what the numerical outcome is.
Totally.
Workout.
So switching gears a little bit, I'm thinking about someone who could be listening or thinking of someone they know and thinking, oh, you know, I actually haven't had my period in however long, you know, longer than 3 months, but I'm not trying to get pregnant right now, or that's not relevant in my life, or I'm past that stage of my life. So like, why should I care if we're talking about fertility and infertility. So why is it still important, if you will, even if that's not the person's mindset?
Yeah, definitely. And I think that this is, I'm so glad you're touching upon this too, because I think that it can be an issue that feels convenient, right? If you're not trying to conceive, whether you don't want to have kids, now or ever, or you've completed your family and you're done. And so, we do want to have our period, and there's kind of more and more like talk coming out about how your period can be considered a fifth vital sign. It's like a monthly report card, so you know what's going on with your body, and you're stressed. We could the period or period could be delayed, kind of like thinking along those lines. But no period at all has some pretty serious long-term health consequences. And one of the biggest, most recognized ones is with our bones. And so when you aren't having that normal monthly rise and fall of estrogen and progesterone, the process in which your bones are breaking down is escalated, and the process in which you would be rebuilding and gaining bone mass is kind of halted. And so it's kind of like a double whammy, and women are at very high risk for osteopenia, so kind of the thinning of the bones, and eventually early onset osteoporosis. And we actually see this, I've seen this in a number of my clients in their 20s and 30s, as they were starting to look like they have bones of 80-year-old women. Luckily, that's a reversible thing, but the best thing that you can do for your bones is to get your period back and to have regular ovulatory cycles, especially if you're in kind of your younger 20, 30s years. You've still got some really good bone building years ahead of you. The other one that's starting to show up is heart health. And so what we've seen with women who have HA is we've seen things like elevated cholesterol. And that's really more due to the fact that our hormones or cholesterol rather, is a building block for hormones. And so if we have cholesterol hanging out in our bloodstream and it's ready to be utilized to make things like estrogen and testosterone, and that process has been shut down and that's not happening, well, then we've got this extra cholesterol just kind of hanging out in the bloodstream. Another thing that we've seen, and this really came more from the Nurses' Health Study, is that they're starting to see that women that, answered that they have either no periods or missing periods or irregular periods, is there's a higher risk for cardiovascular disease in women when they're not having those hormone levels as estrogen. And that kind of has to do with the vascular, or the ability of our veins and arteries to dilate and pump blood appropriately through. And so we're seeing these markers with the cholesterol, sometimes elevated blood pressure, in women kind of more down the line. So those are kind of more long-term consequences. The ones that I would say are more immediate kind of come more from the emotional side. So women that experience HA, and I don't think this is 100% understood. You guys probably know more about this than I do, but just kind of the overlap between anxiety and mood disorders and depression and disordered eating and eating disorders. I think that, having our cycle, we can all agree, there is something that just makes you feel a little more balanced, a little bit more woman, if you will. And then of course the complexities of, if someone's lost their period, there's probably some level of disordered eating going on. And then there's kind of the psychological impact of that as well.
I had a question, almost sort of the opposite of Temimah, meaning, okay, so I do want to get pregnant, but can I just do IVF? Why do I need my period back?
Yeah, good question. So we don't typically see the best outcome. And yes, you technically you probably could do IVF and get pregnant. Now, the cost that might require, both financially and emotionally, is a lot. So I've worked with a lot of clients who go that route and maybe end up with one viable embryo implants, and hey, that's baby number one, and now it's time for baby number two. And it's okay, do we have the funds? Do we have the emotional capacity to go through that again? All the while the individual kind of knowing deep down, what if this was fixable? And so people can get pregnant with HA, they do, but I would say that, you're not addressing the root cause of the problem, right? So somebody completes their family, but they've still got brittle bones at the age of 35. They're still so wrapped up in disordered eating that they have a hard time being present with their families. And I think it kind of comes down to the quality of life whenever we start thinking, well, why not just do fertility treatment? One, there are health consequences, but number two, I would really encourage people, if they're kind of thinking that way, to first recognize that IVF is not easy. It's not a guaranteed success. I work with a lot of clients that have gone through multiple rounds of IVF and failed IVF. And that's heartbreaking, right? But then also too, to think about like, what do you want your life to be like when those kids are 5, 10, 15, and like what kind of quality of life do you want to have as a mother if you never really address like what's going on underneath the surface? And if you choose to do IVF and you're also actively seeking recovery, you're working with an eating disorder therapist, you're working with a registered dietitian, and you just want to get pregnant, I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's a beautiful way to go at it and kind of, you know, best bang for your buck. But I do think that if we're choosing IVF as a way to avoid what might be really going on, I think that there's some really serious, like a physical and emotional health.
That as it relates back to not just conceiving, but carrying your child to term and also caring for that child once it's born and for God willing, many years after.
And I think thinking also, and you're sort of touching on this, thinking about, first of all, the idea that if someone has an eating disorder or struggles with disordered eating, that doesn't necessarily mean they're going to have HA or lose their period. And I want to note that because I think that so many people can hear about like a possible consequence and think, oh, well, I don't have that, so like I must not really be struggling, or mine must not be so bad. So from like kind of the mental health, eating disorder, disordered eating side of it, remembering that yes, there are markers, you know, that can occur when someone is struggling, but they don't happen to everyone. So it's not like that's a way of noting if it's a problem and you need support. You know, that's not how it works. And so we're talking about these potentially lifelong, and they don't have to be lifelong, you know, struggles where maybe, you know, in terms of that IVF question, maybe the person is able to have kids, but then even they're thinking, I don't want my kids to struggle with food or exercise the same way I do. It'll be different by then, you know, or something like that. And how it's really only different by then if you get that support, which is, again, totally out there. But it requires that honesty with oneself that this is not just, oh, it'll go away on its own kind of a thing.
Yeah, definitely. And that is such a good point, right? Because I think that there are women who struggle with various degrees of disordered eating and lose their period. And they're like, this isn't fair. And yet there are also women that struggle deeply with clinical eating disorders and they don't lose their period. And so what that's going to come down to is genetics. And so there has been some more research kind of coming out about this, is that there's a genetic component, and some women are just more prone to period loss and some women aren't. And so while disordered eating and the eating disorder are at play, this isn't going to occur in every single person with an eating disorder. And I would never want to think like, oh, I lost my period, so this isn't that big of a deal, because it isn't.
Now, touching on some of the eating disorder questions, and then we'll get to kind of the big chunk in terms of fertility, infertility, and kind of aspects of pregnancy, carrying a baby. If someone then, you know, finds out they have HA, and they work with a team, and, you know, they end up getting their period back, which is, you know, amazing and very possible, it sounds like. And then they're thinking, okay, so I got my period back, like, now can I kind of go back to doing what I was doing? Like, now do I have the, you know, the red light, or the green light, I should say, to exercise more, to reduce my calories? So what does that look like for someone who is kind of waiting to go back to that way of life, if you will?
Yeah. I mean, I think what we need to remember is, like, if someone develops HA, like, let's learn from our experiences. Like, I would never encourage someone to have a goal to return to the weight or body size they were at when they were missing their period. We already know that that is not a healthy weight or body size for you, even if your BMI is normal. So if we're pursuing that, then if we're pursuing that size, we're likely to end up with the same outcome of period loss and compromised fertility future. So that's like what I would, you know, warn about. And, you know, I think I just want to like double down on like having proper support through the process, because it can feel very exciting to have your period return. It's absolutely a milestone in recovery and something that you should celebrate, but it's really important to be supported in the process of, you know, maintaining a normal cycle, which means maintaining a normal relationship with food and exercise, and really having a proper support team that can guide you through and get you there there as, you know, you're having your period back. That's a great sign of physical recovery, but we also need to make sure we're well supported for getting fully mentally recovered, so we can get to a place where, like, yeah, like, in the culture that we live in, of course, we're going to feel tempted to lose a couple pounds every once in a while, or we're going to, you know, hope that, you know, things are different in the future, or it's not wrong for us to desire that our bodies look different, and especially considering the culture that we live in, but for us to be armed with the proper tools on how to cope with not going back to those ways and not getting into those triggers.
Now, if someone says, okay, I think I need support, and I know this is a problem for me, and they're so terrified of gaining weight, sort of touching on what you just said, living in the culture that we live in, is there, I mean, I'm thinking about how, I don't think there's like an easy answer to this question of kind of like, okay, so how do we approach that? You know, like, I'm terrified of gaining weight, I'm terrified of my body changing, but I also, let's say, want to have children, or I don't want these negative health consequences, or I want to be free from this mindset. You know, I was thinking of that question of like, what then? And I know from my work, there's no easy answer, and typically, you know, it comes down to having a full team approach, if you will, you know, in terms of the medical side, the dietitian, the therapist, and working through, like you said, what are other, you know, tools in your toolkit? What else can you rely on in terms of your relationship with yourself and your identity and your self-worth that's really not about how you look? Because typically there's something about that mixed in, right, with an eating disorder or disordered eating. And I think acknowledging that that's such a hard journey, and it's a totally doable, and there's so much hope on that journey, but to name that takes work, and that usually that team is really the way of getting the person there, if that makes sense.
Totally, 100%. And I would first just acknowledge that, like, that is such a common fear. That is the number one fear in anyone who's experiencing disordered eating disorder, or period loss, right? Is the loss of the body that you worked so hard for. And it can be really hard and really sobering to recognize that something that you worked so hard for isn't healthy. And I think that that's one of the hardest pieces. But, you know, at the end of the day, we have to really think about, like, our values and what we're working towards and what really aligns with who we are, what we want our lives to look like, and, like, what we want to be remembered for. You know, something I don't even remember where I took this from, but it's like, at someone's funeral, they're not going to be saying, oh, you know, Karen, she was a size whatever, and that's what people remember her for. And, like, the people that love you and care about you the most, like, do not care about the size and shape of your body, and, like, that should be something, you know, to kind of cling to in those moments where weight gain.
I think we also, I don't know, sorry if I'm speaking out of time here, but I think we also have to do better as a community to support women who we're not even sure if they're having, you know, a disordered eating issue, but we're constantly in a state of, oh, you look great, you look so skinny, you know. I think the comments that maybe are almost automatic and maybe coming from a good place are not necessarily in good taste most of the time, or we're really just creating a culture whereby people don't feel comfortable unless they're getting that compliment. So I feel like we have to do better too to support women across the community who, I don't care if they have an issue or not, I don't want them to get to that point. I don't want their daughters to get to that point. So
I feel like I think of like 3 rules of things not to do, you know, so in the context of what you're saying. So one is, instead of saying, oh my gosh, you look amazing, have you lost weight, which is almost just like a greeting, right? Like what people say, just say, it's so nice to see you. Like, just replace the language, because typically that's what people are almost like trying to get to, of like, I want to say something nice, you know, but then it's a comment that really encourages this pursuit of a certain body type. Not making jokes or laughing about like different body sizes. It's like I say it's an easy one, but it's so ingrained. And then to touch on the juxtaposition of our topic here, not making comments or asking like, they've been married for so long, where are those kids already? Because we have no idea what's going on. And also, sorry, what would someone answer that with? But, you know, it's a comment that totally disregards a possible struggle? I feel like those are three things that people can walk away with.
Even going into pregnancy and postpartum, like, still, we don't need those kind of, I don't care if I'm 9 months pregnant. Don't tell me I look awesome, you know? There are people who don't gain a lot of weight during pregnancy, and it's an insecurity for them. And of course, postpartum, that bounce back moment of, wow, you just had a baby 3 weeks ago, or 6 or 3 months or 9 months, or there's never a good time to say anything.
Mm-hmm. So one thing I also want to kind of ask about or touch on in terms of the like weight gain piece is this idea also that people will say, and Lindsey, if you can speak to this, like people might say, oh, well, this is the weight I was when I got my period years ago, you know, but why am I not getting it now? Or like I've gained weight, but, you know, almost like, does this really work? You know, like I still haven't gotten my period, and the idea that their weight might need to be higher than what they expect it to be. And I'm curious if that comes up for you.
Yeah, quite often, in fact. And I'll kind of speak to, you know, one scenario specifically is the person who's maybe been missing their period for 10 or 15 years. And they're like, well, you know, the weight I'm at or above the weight that I cycled at last time. But that weight might be when someone was in high school and now they're a grown, you know, 30-year-old woman. And so when we talk about set point weight range, it's something that a set point weight range is a range. This is a theory that our bodies function most optimally in. And so if you've lost your period, you've probably dropped below your genetic set point weight range. Again, even if you're in a healthy weight range for your height. And set point weight range can change as we age, as we have babies, as we go through different seasons of life. And so your healthy cycle weight in high school is likely not going to be your same healthy cycle weight as someone in their 30s, right? Like it's probably going to be a little bit higher. I'll also say too that gaining weight, while it is an important part of getting your period back, it is not the only thing that needs to happen to get your period back. So if you are gaining weight, but you're kind of stuck in this maybe binge restrict cycle with food, or you're still exercising a ton, and you're gaining weight, like it's good, you probably need to gain that weight, but also, you know, we got to get the other factors of recovery in place for your body to be able to recover and feel safe again.
I remember learning that the binge restrict cycle, the cortisol levels there from the stress, you know, when people stop binging, actually that totally changes too, you know, so it's not even just like, I don't think people go into it thinking like, let me binge and then I'll get, you know, I'll gain weight and then I'll get my period, but it's also, that's not helping either, which might sound obvious, but I don't think people realize the actual stress level impacts from binging and restricting.
Yeah, definitely.
So, okay, if someone wants to get their period back, what about birth control in terms of, you know, this idea maybe that it'll like kickstart things, or, you know, with HA, how does that come together?
Yeah, so birth control should never be like the treatment for a missing period. Some doctors will push it for the idea that, well, it's, you know, better that your body has some estrogen than none. Really, and I think that comes like from the idea that like, well, if we're replacing some estrogen, that might help prevent the decline in bone loss. Really, we're not seeing that in research. If somebody has a very severe eating disorder and we don't feel this person will recover their period in a timely manner, hormone replacement therapy can be a good bridge, but birth control not. So going on the pill basically shuts down your body's, in a normal working body, it shuts down your body's hormonal cycle. And so instead of having kind of these dips and spikes of hormones throughout the month, your hormones are kind of just flatlined basically. And that's why some women who are having hormonal imbalances and like really heavy painful periods, that's why maybe people will feel better on the pill, because it's not your hormones, it's again like a flat line. Now, your hormones are already flatlined. It's all it's doing is giving you some baseline estrogen and progesterone for, you know, roughly 3 weeks, and then you take placebo pills and you have that withdrawal bleed from the synthetic hormones that you've been given. And so unfortunately, like in my day, being an older millennial, this is the way that HA was kind of treated. And I think that it gave a lot of people a false sense of, hey, my body's working correctly, when in reality it isn't. So birth control will never jumpstart your period. It's never solving your missing period. It's simply a Band-Aid on the missing period issue.
Okay. You mentioned like the time frame. Is there like a general, and probably very personalized, but is there like a time frame someone would expect, or even like at a minimum kind of a thing in terms of this treatment?
Yeah, I would say 3 to 6 months is normal for seeing periods return. That being said, I have seen people respond to a proper recovery plan very quickly, like in less than a month. And then I have seen people take longer, especially if there is an eating disorder present. Due to a variety of factors, as you guys know, like it is not simple to just eat more food and to just exercise less and to just gain weight. There are a lot of psychological things that an individual needs to be properly supported in overcoming before they can, actually make some forward progress in recovery. So definitely depends on the individual. I would say if the eating disorder is mostly recovered, I would say 3-ish months could be good, but 3 to 6 months might be a good general timeline when somebody is properly supported through this process.
And is there, I'm not sure if this is sort of already included in the HA discussion, but even so the person gets their period back, let's say, or doesn't, right? You said that sometimes someone can lose their period actually and get pregnant, which people I think don't realize can happen. But the relationship between eating, the relationship with food, and like conception of a baby, is there anything that someone would need to know that they need to like do differently that we haven't already talked about?
Like different if someone were wanting to get pregnant versus just recover their period? I think that it just makes everything a little bit more important and a little bit more purposeful when you're about the way that you fuel. And I don't mean this in a way that I want anyone to get hung up on eating perfectly for fertility. But at a bare minimum, I would make sure that you're on a prenatal vitamin 3 to 6 months before you're thinking about getting pregnant. So like if you're starting period recovery being like, I'm ready to be pregnant, I would go ahead and get on a prenatal at a bare minimum. And then just making sure that you're hitting all major food groups, right? So like every single meal that you're eating, it should include carbohydrates, protein, and fat. And so again, without having to get so obsessive about perfect types of eating and numbers and things like that, I always recommend starting with fueling yourself 3 meals a day, because we're in recovery and we're trying to re-nourish our bodies. 3 snacks mixed in, and including carbs, protein, and fat at each of those meals and snacks.
Which I think could be surprising to people, because some of those food groups have been sadly like demonized in a lot of ways, but knowing that like actually that is what's healthy, and healthy is a relative term, which is a whole other discussion. But I feel like that's such an important note. Okay, and what about postpartum? So like lactation and HA and kind of if you're not getting your period while you're nursing, like how does that all come together or intersect?
Yeah, so up to about 6 months postpartum, and exclusively breastfeeding mothers, meaning that breast milk is your baby's sole source of nutrition, you're not supplementing formula, it can be really normal to not have a period. And so if you are, 1 to 6 months postpartum and still no period, that's really normal. I wouldn't freak out about that. In women with a history of period loss, we do see that time frame tend to drag out longer into the 18-month postpartum time. I don't want to actually say that that's completely normal, because I think sometimes people will breastfeed and maybe relapse into some behaviors, and then they're like, oh, well, I'm not getting my period because I'm breastfeeding, and they're 20 months postpartum. And in that case, I would say it's probably more likely to be HA, but there is definitely a gray area. So I usually tell people, like, if you're exclusively breastfeeding, give your body 6 to 12 months to have a period return. If you're 12 months postpartum, especially if you've cut down to more just like morning and night nursing, so maybe you're only nursing once or twice a day and still no period after, a month or so into kind of the night weaning, then that's when I kind of start to get a little bit more concerned that maybe we're...
I think it goes back to what we were saying before about like that being honest with yourself. Like, is this actually from lactation, or am I sort of either going back into a previous cycle, which I assume certainly of the postpartum period can trigger a disordered eating or an eating disorder. I mean, it just makes logical sense, right? Your body certainly looks different. You haven't been exercising, or you're not even allowed for 6 weeks. And I mean, to me, maybe you could speak better to like sort of what that could do to a woman psychologically who may either does or doesn't have an eating disorder.
Totally. I think there are so many people who have never struggled with something, and then that time period, one of you mentioned this, or I think Lindsey, maybe you did, like the idea, maybe it was Rachel, like the bounce back idea, you know, and how toxic that idea is. And this expectation and even a feeling of shame of like, why does my body still look like I carried a baby? And it's like, of course your body still looks like you carried a baby, but that we expect that that's, you know, sort of not acceptable or something like that. And hopefully people here, like, I don't feel like that at all, which is great, you know, but I do think in our culture that's so common. And there are so many women who also, just to add to this, you know, will say, oh, but of course when I'm trying to get pregnant, when I'm pregnant, once I have a baby, of course I'm going to change my behaviors. And I've worked with folks who can't. They can, you know, but it's not as simple as that day when I find out I'm pregnant. And for some people it can be, but then the day they give birth, they cut the cord, you know, and it's sort of, they go right back to, okay, so how do I lose the weight, or how, you know, engaging in the binging or the purging or whatever it is. And I do think that's a time that high stress, you know, especially if there's postpartum depression or anxiety, or maybe not clinically, but those hormones are different. There's so much going on. You're literally trying to get used to caring for another person. And the way of coping with that can almost be, let me dive back in or dive in for the first time. And so that's a really like tender time, and a time to be paying extra attention. And even if it's like, well, I had the baby, I did what I needed to, let me, like we said before, let me go right back to that relationship. Even remembering like how can you be present if it's about the baby? How can you be present for the baby if you're counting things and you're, you know, off on a run or something like that? Or is that what you want to be passing along? And I think ultimately it's also not just about the baby, it's about you, your relationship to yourself and how you feel about who you are. And that being a time, you know, to actually challenge the thing that might feel most tempting. Yeah. So we have like a few minutes left. So I wanted to just ask if people have questions to put it in the comment box. If we can get in a couple of questions, and also, you know, not much time left, but for Rachel and Lindsey, you know, if there's anything that we haven't said that you feel like are either like things you would want to leave listeners with, or something that we didn't touch on that you feel is really essential or even tangential, anything that you're sitting with that you'd want to include.
I think we did a lot. I'm like, I can't believe we put this all in an hour. I think this was essential. And again, it's not necessarily for a woman who is actively trying to conceive. I think this is an essential conversation for all women. And we really have to be there for each other. I think we're the worst of them, sort of. I was in a meeting actually a few months ago with a few women who went through postpartum. And one of them turned to the other and said, I saw you on a bike 2 weeks after you gave birth. So I felt like if you were doing it, then I could do it. And she turned to her and she was like, you're not seeing the full picture. You know, I was struggling. And I think we just have this, again, this culture of sort of judging another and saying, oh, well, she's doing that, so I could do that, right? She's going to this high cardio class 6 days a week, and she has 4 kids. So I could go to high cardio classes 6 days a week, and I could have 4 kids. And really being able to sort of look inside and be honest with yourself. And I don't think it's obviously not much more difficult than I'm making it sound. But that's just one thought I really wanted to talk about.
Yeah. Well, one thing I want to note that I would want to just like add, and then I'll go through the little closing remarks, is also that for people listening, if you're thinking this is something that you've gone through, it's clear you're so not alone. We heard that statistic. And also there's such a sense of shame and secrecy typically when it comes to this type of struggle, and to acknowledge. It's easy for me to say, you don't need to feel shame. That's also almost like a blank statement. Like, what does that mean? You know, if you do, but to know that you don't have to be alone in this, and that you've done nothing wrong, and that there's help, and the Mindful Eating Project is here to help. And there's so many amazing resources out there, because there's totally hope. There's a possibility for change, but it does take that first step in terms of that honesty. So I'm so grateful that you both were here, that everyone joined. Thank you so much for everyone who tuned in. And we are going to be sharing this. We'll post it for anyone who maybe missed something or wants to send it to someone. And if you have questions or anything like that, you can reach out and get more information. So Lindsey, Rachel, thank you so much. Thank you for everyone who's here.
I saw one question about, I'm not sure if this is Lindsey's specialty, but specifically about men with eating disorders and if that could affect their fertility. Sorry, I don't know if you want to keep going. I know the hour is late, so.
Maybe we can answer that and then we'll wrap it up.
Yeah. So yeah, this condition it can happen in men as well. If you look up RED-S, which is relative energy deficit in sport, that's kind of the more technical term for like HA in men. And yes, it can impact male infertility as well.
And for any other questions or thoughts, message us or call the hotline. And there again, between SBH and Lindsey and Mindful Eating Project, we really, our hotline for the Mindful Eating Project, we have many people who are here to answer your questions. So give us a call. Stay tuned for other programs that we'll be offering. And again, thank you both for being here and for this amazing information.
Yes, thanks for having me. Thanks, guys. Bye.